Good morning, my Preaching in Purple family. This is Reverend Dr. Doylanda Alexander back with you another week of Summit Up Saturday. I am so grateful that you've decided to journey with us during this month of August. We're in a series, The Devil's Playground. If you were with us last weekend, then you know that we started out talking about insecurities and the ways in which the enemy can get busy through open doors that we create in our human interactions based on our own insecurities or even how the insecurities of others can negatively impact our lives. And so we're jumping into week 2. And I am just grateful that you are here hanging out with us for Summit Up Saturday. I want to give a disclaimer before I get going this weekend. I have always taught about leadership, mentored leaders, provided all kinds of leadership training. That's a part of what I do. And so I shied away from dealing with leadership in the church sense for a long time because people always assume that you subliminally firing shots off at your leader when you talk about leadership. So I have to give my disclaimer that I'm good where I am. I'm good with my leadership. We are solid. We have no issues over around on this here street. So I want to make sure I give that disclaimer before this week's lesson, because we're going to be dealing with the flip side of leadership. And the reality is that I have always dealt with leadership from angles and perspectives that aren't normally addressed and aren't normally talked about. And that's what can make what I do and the way that I'm called to do it a little difficult sometimes. But I promise you, you don't have to, send any inboxes, messages, emails, or clips. We're good over in this here parts. This is a general message to address the general body and deal with some things that 100% have made room to be a devil's playground. So now that that's out there, let's jump into this week's message and get going. We are in week 2 once again of our series, The Devil's Playground. This week, y'all, we are talking about accountability. Accountability. I'm not even going to belabor the time. Let's go ahead and get into it. 1 Timothy 5, verse 19, and I'm reading this week from the New Revised Standard Version, the updated edition, and it just simply says, "Never accept any accusation against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses." Never entertain any accusation against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Accountability is defined as the practice of being held to a certain standard of excellence. It's the idea that an individual is responsible for their actions, and if that individual chooses unfavorable actions, then they'll face consequences. The interesting thing about accountability is that it's often spoken of and talked about, but rarely enforced. Whether it's at our places of employment, the organizations that we're members of, or even our churches. Accountability seems to escape those who need it the most. And because of the lack of accountability in these places and spaces, we've created an entire population of people who believe that they can do what they want to whomever they want, whenever they want, and not have to answer for it. Even when someone does speak up and out about the offense that they've experienced, they're considered the problem. Now they are the issue for expecting folks to simply do right and treat them right. Accountability. When looking at this particular passage, the initial thought that comes to mind, I'm sure, isn't about a lack of accountability. The immediate thought is protecting those in leadership from false accusations by not entertaining anything negative that someone has to say about them. But what if it's more than one person who has the same experience with that leader? What if multiple members over a span of time have the same story to tell? Or what if multiple employees at the job file the same kind of report with HR about the same supervisor? Paul does something masterful here in 1 Timothy 5 and strikes a balance between believing and acting on every bit of gossip that comes along about a leader in the church and ignoring serious sin in a leader's life. Either of those extremities is wrong. In context, this verse points back to Deuteronomy 19 and 15, which speaks to the testimony of one person not being enough to charge someone with a crime or connect them to wrongdoing. A judicial conviction was not permitted without the testimony of at least two witnesses. And ordinarily, Timothy might entertain the accusation without witnesses, but not when dealing with an elder, a leader of the church. In order for Timothy to even cite the elder, meaning bring them up on charges, there had to be 2 or 3 witnesses. There had to be 2 or 3 people who saw or heard the incident and can attest to it. Well, we aren't even talking about the conviction yet, just simply to bring up the charge. So to be clear, 2 things had to happen in order for there to be a hearing against an elder accused of a crime. That there had to be an accusation, a specific charge. So not feeling, not hearsay, but a verifiable incident. And then there had to be an accusation that was witnessed, received by 2 or more witnesses. 2 or 3, or in some cases, we know the list gets long of how many people have encountered and interacted with this person and had the same kind of negative experience. So those 2 things had to be a part of this process in order for the idea of a hearing to even be entertained. And now this is a good thing. Okay, based on the text, that's a good thing, because the goal was to cover good leaders while also leaving room to address the real issues when they arose. But now this is where there's room for things to get crazy and for the enemy to sometimes get busy. Folks who've been the direct target of an offense or those who've witnessed the offense bring a legitimate complaint against a person in a position of authority and they're ignored. Or even worse, they, as the victim, get treated like the villain. Too often, people who have had experiences that are very real, and they follow procedure, because I hear some of you already saying, well, did they go to them and have a conversation with them individually? They followed what Jesus outlines in the Gospels, to go to them, have that one-on-one conversation. And if that interaction doesn't yield any fruit, then there are next steps that you are then to hold that person accountable before with another witness, right? And then if still it's not fixed, then you have to go before the whole body. So we've got directives on how to handle things individually, but then we also understand that this can apply in the bigger sense. But what tends to happen, what has happened, is that when someone chooses to speak up outside of that one-on-one interaction because of the position of authority that this person is in, they have to go to a higher ranking voice to be able to be heard, or so they think to be heard. They get silenced. So we have people that are leaving churches because they reported an issue to the senior pastor, or if need be to the deacons or the elders, and they're ignored or called crazy. Or at work, issues are reported to HR, and now the victims are faced with acts of retaliation, and the list goes on and on. So now a lack of accountability for the wrongdoer creates an environment of mistrust, of toxic behaviors, and room for seeds to be planted in folks' hearts, minds, and spirits. And the fruit of those seeds are ugly and unhealthy for the natural and spiritual well-being of someone who simply needs to be heard, believed, and protected. And then there's another side to the coin. The person who doesn't say anything because they fear what the outcome will be. So now there aren't even 2 or 3 witnesses who can come together to speak about the problem because no one is willing to be the one to say what needs to be said. But we have to ask ourselves, how did we get here? It's because people have been conditioned to say nothing because systems have turned victims into the problem. People have been conditioned to believe that speaking up will get them put out. People have been conditioned to say, why bother? Because when accountability should have been the result of their speaking up, they instead see a cover up. It's an age-old issue in our world, and I struggle with understanding how we got to the place of not holding folks accountable when there's evidence and proof of wrongdoing. How can you have 34 felony convictions and still run for the highest office in the United States? How can you have pictures, videos, text messages, I mean all the receipts, and still no accountability? This creates a devil's playground, a place where the enemy can have a field day because we left the door open by allowing manipulation, mistreatment, and mess to have their way. We co-signed bad behaviors and said they just need time to mature, but we never checked them. We committed biblical malpractice and told people that touch not my anointed, do my prophets no harm, meant that you can't say anything when you've been harmed by leadership because that's God's man or that's God's woman. And that's not even what the text means. The text refers to all of God's people as God's anointed and prophets, not just the select church leaders in our created hierarchical systems. So who is really out of line when there are 2, 3, 30 witnesses with the same issue, with the same person? When folks who've really done wrong aren't held accountable, 3 things happen. First of all, the villain continues to do damage. Have you ever encountered someone with an ugly disposition who's been in a position for 20 plus years? And you're talking to people and you're like, how do they still have their role? How do they still have their position? How do they still have their job? And the response is because everybody knows that's just who they are. Or everybody knows that's just how they are. Or somebody said something some years ago, but nothing happened. So, they just moved on and found another job because this person never got dealt with. That's unacceptable. You don't get to create a revolving door of members or volunteers or employees because people have given up and decided to allow you to just be who you are. There has to be some checking. There has to be some accountability. Secondly, when this is allowed to continue and go unchecked, the victims rightfully resent the systems and people who they thought were supposed to protect them. I'm going to jump out there and talk about it very quickly here. Church hurt. We've heard so many people share their stories of experiences of hurt within the church. And on the flip side, it's usually those of us who are leaders in some form of ministry or pastoring or church or whatever the case may be, that we typically perpetuate the standing firm on, you didn't get hurt by the church, you got hurt by people in the church. And we say that this term church hurt is not a real thing. And really and truly, it is a real thing. It's dealing with emotional, psychological traumas that have happened to people because of gaslighting by folks in the church, because of mistreatment by folks in the church, because of what I called earlier, biblical malpractice by folks within the church. And, we jokingly say, well, we don't talk about job hurt. We don't talk about the job did something to us. People go to therapy because of the ridiculousness in the systems and structures on their jobs as well. The caveat usually and the catch-22 is that folks can't quickly walk away from their place of employment because they're getting paid to be there. They can't walk away so quickly from their place of employment when there's a check coming every week or every 2 weeks or every month that is their livelihood. They have to figure out how to maneuver those systems a little bit differently until they find another job. They have to figure out how to maneuver those relationships and those dealings a little differently. But you don't expect to show up for free on Sundays or Wednesdays for Bible study or on Saturdays for meetings. You don't expect to show up to a place for free, where you're supposed to have your spiritual soul care, your care in that aspect every week. You don't expect to show up to that place and experience mistreatment. You don't expect to show up to that place and need to leave and go to a therapy session. That's not an expectation that I believe that anyone who goes to church, values church, and loves church expects to have. So when that encounter happens, it is valid that traumatic experience hurts a little deeper, because this is supposed to be my place where I come to be nourished and nurtured to go face the world outside, not to have to figure out how to deal with all of that contention inside and outside. Because then it does raise the question, why am I here? So yes, people begin to resent the systems that are in place. They begin to resent the people who they thought would protect them, who they thought would hold folks accountable. Then finally, not only when accountability is not being served the way that it should, and folks are not being held accountable for their actions and their behaviors and their words, the systems of oppression don't change. Systems of oppression don't change. When the oppressors are allowed to function, allowed to stay in their seat, allowed to continue to lead people, be responsible for people, to manage people, to supervise people, and they have an ugliness about themselves that has not been checked. When that happens, the systems don't change. When multiple witnesses can come to the table and say, this is my experience, this is what I know to be true, this is what happened. When people say we saw it and we heard it too, and nothing is done, that says that the system that's in place and what is yielded from that person and what we gain from the work that they do, what we gain from their presence is more important than all of these souls. And I don't think that's the message that we want to send. It's definitely not the message that we should send. I believe in grace. I believe in forgiveness. I don't believe in willful ignorance. We can no longer pretend that we don't have those among us who need to be held accountable for their behaviors. Not only do we do right by the victims when we act on their behalf, but we can potentially set the offender on their own path of healing and restoration. We can't fear the messy work of holding each other accountable. Not if we desire the best for God's people and the kingdom. This wasn't one of those shouting lessons or messages today, but I do certainly hope you learned something to take away, to even begin to hold yourself accountable if you're the person who has been caught doing harm. If you know, and we know, when we sit with ourselves, if we really believe in our relationship with God and we really believe that God will check us too, that God will check us first, we know when we've done wrong. So let's start working on some self-accountability so that we don't even have to get to this place of systems and leadership teams and folks needing to hold us accountable, getting called down to HR. Let's do some self-checking first. But then, for those who have been the victims, know that you are heard, you are seen, and there are those of us who are here to work on your behalf. We can be good leaders. And we can be better leaders by also holding those accountable within our systems and structures who are trying to tear down the very thing that we're building. I love y'all. This wraps up the second week of our series, The Devil's Playground. I hope that you join me right back here next Saturday for another edition of Summit Up Saturday. Grace and peace be unto you.